The Galactic Council chamber loomed vast and foreboding, a great dome of obsidian and flickering constellations that mimicked the unrelenting cold of space. Holograms of distant planets shimmered above the circular table, casting their ethereal glow upon the grim faces of 23 alien representatives. The air vibrated with tension, a silent storm of resentment and veiled hostility. At the center of the assembly stood High Chancellor Viator, his chitinous frame towering over the gathered dignitaries. His mandibles clicked in agitation, a sharp staccato against the otherwise hushed chamber. To his right, Commander Monadar of the Zelvar brooded in silence, his scaled visage unreadable, but his golden eyes glinting with the predatory patience of his kind. Across from them, Rain Voss of the Marn sat languidly, feline features betraying amusement rather than concern, while technocrat Ulgus of the Zephyr remained impassive, his synthetic gaze processing every detail with cold efficiency. The murmurs ceased as the chamber doors parted with a hiss. A single figure strode forward unhurried, exuding a confidence that bordered on insolence. Ambassador Alexander Crowley adjusted the cuffs of his dark blue suit, his every step echoing like a gavel strike. His entrance was deliberate, measured, as if he were the one presiding over the council rather than the accused. And nestled comfortably in his arms was a white Persian cat, pristine and unbothered, as though utterly indifferent to the war-torn deliberations of the galaxy's most powerful beings. Several council members recoiled at the sight of the animal. Monadar's upper lip curled, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. "That creature does not belong here," he hissed, voice thick with disdain. Crowley barely spared him a glance. "Neither do half the people at this table, but here we are." With practiced ease, he slid into his seat, the cat settling onto his lap, purring contentedly as he scratched behind its ear. "You called, I answered. Shall we get this over with?" Viator's mandibles flared, his temper barely restrained. "You would do well to understand the gravity of this meeting, human." He gestured with a clawed hand, and a holographic display erupted in the center of the chamber. Footage from a dozen sources compiled into a single damning sequence. Human warships, sleek and angular, breaching a designated neutral sector. Vast industrial complexes, rising on unclaimed moons. Secretive testing facilities running experiments that defied interstellar accords. Each image was another weight upon the Council's collective patience. "You have violated our laws," Viator continued, voice resonating through the chamber. "Expansion into restricted zones. The development of prohibited technology. And most egregiously," he leaned forward, black eyes narrowing, "the excavation of Site 17, a ripple of unease passed through the room. Even those who had remained neutral shifted uncomfortably. Crowley exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie. "Ah, so this is about that." He traced lazy circles on his cat's back, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "You defiled an ancient boundary," Monadar growled, talons digging into the table. "Your kind was warned." "Curious thing about warnings," Crowley mused. "They're often vague. If you didn't want anyone poking around, perhaps a do not touch sign would have sufficed." Viator struck the table with an armored limb. "Enough. Humanity is given one chance, one final opportunity to prove it can coexist within the lawful order of the galaxy. You will cease all expansion immediately. You will surrender all research derived from Site 17, and you will dismantle every unauthorized military installation within the next rotation." His mandibles clacked with finality. "Or we will bring war to your doorstep." The room bristled with the unspoken certainty behind his words. This was not a mere threat. It was a promise. For the first time since his arrival, Crowley's expression shifted just a fraction. He sighed, his fingers stilling against the cat's fur. Then, with an almost imperceptible shake of his head, he chuckled. It was a quiet sound, but in the charged silence, it rang like a gunshot. Rain Voss leaned forward, intrigued. "Something amusing, Ambassador?" Crowley's eyes gleamed with something dangerously close to mirth. "I was just thinking," he said, "how predictable this all is. A flicker of confusion passed through the assembled delegates. Crowley gestured vaguely at the projection before them. You stand here, rattling your sabers, convinced that humanity is either reckless or ignorant. You issue ultimatums, believing we'll fall in line, same as all the others before us. He leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. But let me ask you something, gentlemen. If you truly had the power to wipe us out, why haven't you done it already? A tense beat followed. Technocrat Ulgis inclined his head, synthetic lenses whirring as he considered the question. A calculated decision, he said at last. The risk of mutual devastation outweighs the benefits. Crowley smiled. And therein lies your problem. He reached into his suit jacket, withdrawing a slim, metallic case. You assume this is still a game of risk assessment, that you hold all the cards. With a flick of his wrist, he placed the case onto the table. The room fell deathly still. Crowley tapped the surface, and the case split open with a soft hiss, revealing a data pad embedded within. The screen flickered to life, displaying a single line of text. Viator's mandibles twitched as he read the words. Rain Voss' tail flicked, his pupils dilating. Ulgis, ever unreadable, merely observed. Only Monadar spoke. His voice was uncharacteristically low. You're bluffing. Crowley exhaled through his nose. Would you like to find out? The chamber remained silent. Then, deliberately, Crowley shut the case, tucking it back into his jacket. Here's the thing, gentlemen, he said, rising to his feet. You've spent centuries dictating the rules of the universe, but you failed to consider one simple truth. He turned toward the exit, pausing just long enough to cast them one final look over his shoulder. You never accounted for us. With that, he strode out, his cat purring softly in his arms. Behind him, the Galactic Council sat in stunned silence, their carefully constructed reality beginning to crack. Alexander Crowley walked the cold, winding halls of the Galactic Council's diplomatic wing with the ease of a man who had long since stopped fearing threats, be they spoken in hushed tones or declared in grand, theatrical proclamations. He cradled Solomon in one arm while his free hand adjusted his cuffs. The council chamber's heavy doors sealed behind him, a metallic groan echoing through the corridor, but he did not turn back. They would call him again soon enough. The air inside his private suite was crisp, purified to an almost clinical sterility, likely an insult masked as a courtesy, considering the council's disdain for human biology. Crowley barely noticed. He settled into the high-backed chair near the window, where the abyss of space stretched endlessly beyond the transparent panel. With a flick of his fingers, a control panel rose from the armrest, and he activated a secure transmission line. The screen shimmered, then resolved into the face of a grizzled officer, dark-skinned and battle-worn, the rigid insignia of the Terran Defense Authority gleaming at his shoulder. Crowley, the man greeted, voice like grinding stone. You stirred the nest. Crowley sighed, scratching behind Solomon's ear as the cat stretched luxuriously. That's the nature of diplomacy, Admiral Rhodes. Sometimes you need to tip the beehive just to see who stings first. Rhodes folded his arms, and Crowley exhaled slowly. They gave their ultimatum. Cease all expansion. Surrender everything we've learned from Site 17. Dismantle our military holdings. He let the weight of the words settle before adding, or they bring war to our doorstep. A heavy pause followed. Rhodes didn't blink. You already knew that was coming. I did, Crowley admitted. What I wanted to see was how they'd react when I reminded them that humanity doesn't bluff. The Admiral's expression darkened. And how did they react? Crowley reached into his jacket and withdrew the metallic case. He flipped it open, gazing at the screen's lone line of text. Then, with the same measured tone he had used before the council, he spoke. They don't know what we found. Rhodes tensed ever so slightly, a barely perceptible shift, but one that spoke volumes. You're sure? Certain? Crowley murmured. They think we uncovered something dangerous, something forbidden. But they assume it's just another weapon, another relic of a war long past. He closed the case with a quiet click. They have no idea. Rhodes leaned in, voice lowering. Then you need to tell me now, how bad is it? Crowley's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. He turned his gaze back to the void beyond the window, as if searching for the right words among the stars. The truth was, there were no words for what they had found. The footage had arrived in fragments, distorted by electromagnetic interference and time itself. It had taken weeks to piece together, and even then, the picture it painted was imperfect, an impressionist nightmare of half-seen horrors and silent screams. It had started with an excavation. A research team of 23 scientists had landed on an uncharted moon orbiting a dying sun. The moon itself was unremarkable, a wasteland of ice and blackened rock, lifeless and untouched for untold millennia. What lay beneath, however, was another matter entirely. The facility had been vast, impossibly ancient. Its walls were composed of a material that defied known metallurgy, its corridors sprawling deeper than their scanners could map. No records existed of its construction. No civilization, past or present, claimed it. The first teams reported anomalies almost immediately. Instruments malfunctioned. Audio recordings captured whispers where no voices should have been. Hours of footage corrupted without explanation. Then, one by one, the scientists started disappearing. The last transmission had been brief. Static, labored breathing, a flickering image of a man's face, pale, eyes wide with something far worse than fear. His voice, barely above a whisper. They were never gone. Then the feed had gone dead. Rhodes listened without interruption as Crowley relayed the details, his expression hardening with each passing moment. When the ambassador finally fell silent, the admiral exhaled sharply, his breath a slow, controlled release of tension. "How much does the council know?" Rhodes asked. Crowley shook his head. "Only that we've found something. They think we've been reckless, that we've uncovered a forbidden technology, maybe an unstable weapon." His fingers tapped against the case once more. "But this isn't technology, Admiral." He met Rhodes' gaze through the screen. "It's something else entirely." Rhodes frowned, considering. If the council knew the truth, they'd still come for us. Crowley interrupted. "Only this time, they wouldn't be issuing ultimatums. They'd be erasing us." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The weight of their reality settled between them, a silent, suffocating thing. Finally, Rhodes ran a hand over his face and muttered, "Hell, quite." The Admiral straightened, steel returning to his posture. "Do we have containment?" "For now," Crowley admitted, "but we don't understand it. Not fully. And we don't know how long containment actually means." Rhodes leaned forward. "Then we're out of time for diplomacy." Crowley allowed himself a humorless smile. It was always a delaying tactic. "You and I both knew that." He reached for his tea, found it cold, and set it aside. "The only question that remains is whether the council intends to act before we're ready." Rhodes considered that, then said, "And if they do?" Crowley glanced down at Solomon, who regarded him with a serene, utterly unconcerned expression. "Then," Crowley murmured, "we stop waiting." The transmission cut. Alone in his quarters, Crowley let out a slow breath. He could feel the coming storm, its weight pressing against the edges of the universe, waiting for the first crack. The council believed they were the architects of this confrontation, that their terms dictated the course of what was to come. They were wrong. The pieces were already in motion, and humanity, against all odds, was ready. The message arrived in the dead silence of Crowley's quarters, a blinking red alert on his private console. No diplomatic embellishments, no pretense of civility, just a single line of text, stark and unambiguous. Human colony under attack. Confirmed Council line forces. For a long moment, Crowley simply stared at the words. Then, with deliberate calm, he set down his glass of whiskey, rose from his chair, and straightened his tie. Solomon barely stirred from his lap, letting out a languid stretch before curling into the warm indent Crowley left behind. This, Crowley knew, was the moment everything changed. By the time he reached the secure communications terminal, Admiral Rhodes' face was already waiting for him, grim and unyielding. No pleasantries were exchanged. "Where?" Crowley asked, voice devoid of inflection. "Outer system," Rhodes replied. "Vesper Prime." Crowley inhaled through his nose. "Casualties?" "Preliminary reports estimate 5,000 already lost." The Admiral's voice did not waver, but the lines around his mouth deepened. "That number will climb if we don't intervene." Crowley exhaled slowly, measured. His fingers pressed against the cool metal of the console. Who fired first? Rhodes' jaw tightened. Zelvar and Pralin-AK war fleets. They came without warning. Of course they had. Crowley had seen the barely contained rage in Monadar's golden eyes, the crackling fury in Viator's mandibles. The Council had postured, blustered, pretended to negotiate, but in the end, they had never truly intended diplomacy. This attack was not a lapse in control. It was calculated, a preemptive strike. Crowley turned away from the screen, his mind already moving through the next steps. The Council would disavow knowledge of this attack, claim it as an unauthorized act of rogue military leaders. That was how they operated. Plausible deniability, plausible regret. It was a game played in shadows, hidden beneath the pretense of order. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated what humanity was willing to do in return. Rhodes was speaking again, his voice taut. "Orders, Crowley." Crowley flexed his fingers, releasing the tension that had begun coiling in his knuckles. Then, without hesitation, he gave the command that would change the course of history. "Engage." There was no ceremony, no grand speeches. The Admiral simply nodded once, and the connection terminated. Within moments, the first human warships entered the fray. At the edges of Vesper Prime, deep space sensors flickered as vessels materialized from folded space, slipping into reality like specters emerging from the void. Where the Council's fleets were proud and adorned with the banners of countless civilizations, humanity's ships bore no such decoration. Their hulls were matte, their lines sharp, functional, lethal. They did not come to display power. They came to end a war before it began. The first human salvo cut through the darkness, piercing the flanks of a Pralin-AK dreadnought before it could fully register their arrival. The explosion flared like a dying star, shockwaves rippling outward as debris scattered into the void. Within seconds, the battlefield became a crucible of light and destruction. Crowley did not watch the battle unfold. There was nothing left to witness that he had not already expected. Instead, he stood at the window of his quarters, gazing at the distant horizon of stars, feeling the weight of inevitability settle upon his shoulders. The Council had never truly wanted peace. But now, at long last, they would learn what it meant to wage war against a species that did not kneel. A chime interrupted his thoughts. Another incoming transmission, this one marked with a diplomatic priority code. He allowed himself a small, humorless smile. Right on schedule. With a flick of his wrist, the console came alive once more, revealing the coiled form of High Chancellor Viator. The Pralin-AK's mandibles twitched erratically, a sign of barely controlled fury. Behind him, the council chamber was in disarray. Representatives shouting, frantic movement, chaos spilling into the carefully controlled facade they had maintained for centuries. The veneer of unity was cracking. Crowley took his seat, crossing one leg over the other. Solomon leapt onto his lap, stretching luxuriously before settling into a contented loaf. Viator wasted no time with pleasantries. "Call off your forces." Crowley arched a brow. Is that a request or another ultimatum? A furious clicking noise erupted from the Chancellor's throat. "You have no right to this retaliation." "No right?" Crowley tilted his head, voice laced with mock curiosity. "That's an interesting stance. Consider it was your fleets that fired the first shot." Viator's mandibles flared, But it was not Monadar who spoke next. "Ambassador," said Rain Voss, the Marin representative. Unlike Viator, he was not filled with bluster or outrage. His golden eyes flickered with something far more dangerous: calculation. This battle is escalating beyond containment. The Council does not seek prolonged conflict. Crowley met his gaze. Then why did it start one? The feline ambassador's tail flicked once, a subtle tick of consideration. Perhaps miscalculations were made. There is still a path to resolution. Crowley let silence fill the space between them. Let them squirm. Let them feel, for the first time, the uncertainty of dealing with humanity. When he finally spoke, his voice was light, almost conversational. "Tell me, Rain, have you ever wondered why we're still here?" The Marin narrowed his eyes. Elaborate, Crowley ran a slow hand down Solomon's back, watching the way the cat's fur shifted beneath his fingers. "You and your council have always believed humanity's rise was an anomaly, that our expansion was reckless, that we defied reason by surviving against the odds." He glanced up, his gaze sharp as a blade. "But if that were true, we should have fallen long ago." A hush fell over the chamber. Even Viator, still seething, did not interrupt. Crowley leaned forward. "The truth, gentlemen, is that humanity doesn't survive by chance. We survive because we adapt. Because every time someone believes they have figured out what we are, we become something new." He held their gazes, letting the words sink in. "And right now, at this very moment, we are no longer the species you thought we were." A flicker of unease crossed Viator's expression. Rain Voss' tail stilled. Even the Zypher technocrat, normally an emotionless observer, tilted his head as if recalculating probabilities. "Good." Crowley stood, gently lifting Solomon as he did, and set the cat down on the polished floor. He smoothed out his jacket, adjusting his cuffs. "Here's my counteroffer," he said. "You call off your forces, and we'll consider sparing what's left of them." The fury returned to Viator's face, but before he could respond, Crowley severed the transmission. He took a slow breath. The first move had been played. The Council had assumed it was setting the board, that humanity would react predictably. They had been wrong. Now, they would begin to understand. The war was not theirs to control anymore. It never had been. The silence in the war room was the kind that carried weight, thick and suffocating, pressing down on every individual present. The battle over Vesper Prime was still raging, but its outcome was no longer the focal point. Something far worse had taken its place. Admiral Rhodes stood stiff-backed, arms crossed over his broad chest, his eyes fixed on the hollow display before him. Dozens of blinking indicators showed the positions of human and Council fleets locked in brutal combat. But one signal pulsed ominously at the periphery of the system. An unknown fleet had entered real space, and it was not one of theirs. Crowley, seated at the far end of the room, exhaled slowly. He reached into his jacket, retrieved his silver case, and opened it with a practiced flick. The message was still there, unchanged. A single line of text, written by a scientist who had not lived long enough to explain it. They were never gone. The signal from Site 17 had not been a distress beacon. It had not been a remnant of some long-dead civilization, waiting to be uncovered. It had been a summoning. And now, something had answered. The unknown fleet moved without hesitation. No formation adjustments, no tactical posturing, just relentless, unerring forward momentum. The first ships broke through the debris field, and every sensor in the system screamed at once. The energy signatures were unlike anything recorded. There was no radio chatter, no encoded frequencies, no attempt at communication. Just the cold advance of an intelligence that did not recognize them as something worth addressing. Rhodes' voice was quiet but edged with steel. "We need to move our forces back. Now." Crowley's fingers drummed against the table. "And where, exactly, would you suggest we move them?" "They're everywhere." He gestured at a holomap where the unidentified vessels had already spread across multiple vectors. cutting through both human and council fleets with silent efficiency. There were no weapon discharges, no plasma bolts, no kinetic railfire. Just ships disappearing the moment they crossed paths with the unknown. Vanished. No wreckage. No bodies. As if they had been erased from existence. Rain Voss, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet throughout the briefing, finally spoke. "This isn't a war," he murmured. His golden eyes, usually sharp with amusement, were dull now. "It's a purge." The words settled over the room like a burial shroud. For centuries, the Council had been the arbiter of order. They had declared themselves the keepers of peace, the enforcers of balance. But in their arrogance, they had forgotten something fundamental. The universe does not tolerate stagnation. And now, the long-dormant power that had once wiped entire civilizations from history had returned to correct its mistake. A chime interrupted the stillness. Incoming transmission. The air grew colder as the holographic feed flickered to life, displaying a being unlike any they had seen before. It was neither organic nor artificial, neither mechanical nor flesh. Its form shifted, light bending around it in ways the mind struggled to comprehend. When it spoke, it did so in a voice that carried weight, not in volume, but in presence, as if reality itself trembled beneath its words. "You are irredeemable. No accusation, no anger, just a statement, final and absolute." Crowley straightened. "And you are?" He already knew the answer, but the question needed to be asked. The entity's form rippled, its presence pressing against them like the pull of a black hole. "We are the architects of balance. We were before you. We will be after you." Rhodes' fingers curled into fists. "If you're looking for surrender, you won't get it." "Surrender?" the voice echoed, almost curious. "You misunderstand. There is no surrender. There is only correction." The hologram shifted, showing something far worse than an enemy fleet. It was a map, the map. Every occupied system in known space, highlighted with the same eerie glow. The entity had not come to negotiate. It had come to erase. Crowley inhaled slowly. "This isn't just about us." He turned to Rain Voss, to the Zypher technocrat, to the council representatives who had once believed themselves untouchable. "This is about all of us." For the first time, even Viator looked shaken. His mandibles clicked rapidly, a nervous tick Crowley had never seen before. What are they?" he murmured. Crowley's grip on the table tightened. The ones who came before, the galaxy had myths. Legends whispered of an age before the Council, before the rise and fall of empires. Stories of a force that swept across the stars, resetting the balance whenever civilizations grew too much, too ambitious, too disruptive, too arrogant. For centuries, those stories had been dismissed. Folk tales, superstitions. They were wrong. A new alert flashed on the holo display. Fleet-wide broadcast. Human. Rhodes turned to Crowley, waiting for a signal. The ambassador didn't hesitate. "Patch me through." The next words he spoke were transmitted across every Terran vessel, every open channel, human and alien alike. "This is Ambassador Alexander Crowley of the Terran Accord. To all forces receiving this transmission, listen carefully. The war you were fighting no longer matters. The enemy you thought you knew is irrelevant. The beings before us do not recognize borders, treaties, or authority. They do not care who fired first. They do not negotiate. They erase. And they have decided that we no longer belong." A pause, just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. I don't know what you believe in. Your people, your gods, your legacy. But if you want any of it to mean something tomorrow, you fight today. Not as Terrans, not as Council loyalists. As the last line between existence and oblivion, his voice dropped lower, the final note carrying through the static like a blade through flesh. "We are no longer enemies. We are the only ones left." The transmission cut. For the first time in history, a unified command formed between species that had spent centuries in distrust and conflict. Human and council forces alike turned their weapons, not upon each other, but upon the abyss descending upon them. It was not enough. The unknown ships continued their silent advance, their presence an unstoppable force against weapons that had never been designed to fight something like this. Crowley watched the display, watched as entire wings of fighters vanished, as dreadnoughts turned to empty space. There was no victory here, only inevitability. And then, something unexpected happened. The unknown hesitated. It was imperceptible to most, nothing more than a fractional delay. But Crowley saw it, felt it. For the first time, the perfect, relentless march stopped. He exhaled, something dangerous flickering in his gaze. "You don't recognize us, do you?" His voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. "You see us as another failed cycle, another species overreaching." He leaned forward, fingers steepled. "But that's where you're wrong." The entity did not respond, but the weight of its presence shifted, no longer wholly dismissive. Crowley pressed on. "Every civilization you've erased, every one of them failed to stop you. They were strong but predictable, orderly." His lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "But humanity? We don't break the rules. We change them." The silence stretched long and heavy. Then the unknown moved, not forward, not in attack, but in something far stranger. They paused. It was not a victory, not yet, but it was the first crack in the absolute. Crowley stood, smoothing his jacket, his heartbeat steady. The final game had begun, and for the first time in its long, long history, the unknown hesitated.